Have you noticed that every night, without any resistance, you simply vanish? The story of who you are, your name, your memories, your ambitions, dissolves as if it had never been. The bed remains, the body breathes, but the one who you called you, your whole life, slips into nothing. It happens so easily, so completely, that most of us never pause to consider the enormity of it. You close your eyes, and the person you've spent a lifetime building simply disappears. In the light of day, we cling to a certainty. I am here, I am real, I am continuous. But if this identity were solid, if it really were the unshakable core we believe it to be, how could it vanish so effortlessly every night? Where does the self go when deep sleep takes hold? And if it can disappear without struggle, can it truly be what we are? This paradox is not abstract. It touches the most intimate experience you have. Every human being, every philosopher, every scientist, every mystic lays down to sleep and experiences the annihilation of self. Dreams may conjure new identities, strange narratives, fleeting characters, but in the stillness of deep sleep, even those dissolve. The self that felt so enduring a moment before is nowhere to be found. Tonight, when you fall asleep, you'll rehearse your own disappearance once again. Yet, something remains. Morning arrives, and awareness stirs once again, though not always with the same self you carried into the night. The mystery lives here. What is this continuity, and why does it not require you to exist? In this journey, we will explore how neuroscience shows the brain's self-networks falling silent, how philosophy reveals the self as a fragile model, and how ancient wisdom has long pointed to the gap where identity dissolves. By the end, the simple act of closing your eyes may never feel ordinary again. Remember, this isn't the ultimate truth. It's a perspective, a lens. The real truth is what you find. Subscribe and keep looking with us, because the questions only get deeper. You close your eyes, and then nothing. A silence deeper than thought takes over, and the thread of identity that felt unbreakable during the day is simply gone. No name, no story. Hours pass without a witness, and yet the body breathes, the heart beats, and something in you is preserved, though not the self you know. This ordinary act, repeated every night, is one of the strangest proofs that the self is far less permanent than it appears. Neuroscience has mapped part of this vanishing. During wakefulness, the brain's default mode network hums with activity, stitching together memory, imagination, and self-reflection into the familiar sense of me. But in the depths of slow-wave sleep, those same hubs fall quiet. The regions that generate autobiographical thought and internal narrative dim down, until the coherent self no longer holds together. What remains is a body sustained by biology, but emptied of the voice you think of as yourself. Dreams complicate the picture further. In them, identity becomes fluid. One night you are yourself, but in a different body. Another night, you live as a stranger, or even multiple characters, shifting in rapid sequence. Sometimes you are not present in the dream at all, only an observer of a story unfolding without you. Each shift undermines the idea of a continuous, unbroken identity. If the self were truly solid, how could it morph so easily, or vanish altogether, in the theater of dreaming? And yet, we rarely fear this nightly annihilation. Children don't cry out in terror at the thought that they will not exist for several hours. Adults don't mourn the temporary death of their identity before drifting off. We accept it instinctively, as natural as breathing. This reveals something profound. The disappearance of the self is not an aberration, but part of the design of consciousness itself. The unsettling truth is that you already die every night, without noticing. The self, which feels indispensable in daylight, proves itself fragile and dispensable as darkness falls, and still, you awaken again, as if from nowhere, carrying the illusion forward. What does this say about the reality of the self? If it can vanish so completely, yet life continues untouched, perhaps the self is not the anchor of existence we imagine it to be, but only a passing shape in a deeper current. The self feels indispensable. It seems like the one constant through which experience flows. Yet modern science has begun to dismantle this certainty, showing that identity is not a solid essence, but a process that can be toggled on and off. Take lucid dreaming. In ordinary dreams, you can live through entire scenarios without once questioning who you are or whether the dream is real. But when the prefrontal regions of the brain stir back to life during REM sleep, a shift happens. Reflection returns. You recognize this is a dream. That flicker of self-awareness is enough to transform the entire experience. A change in brain activity brings the self back online, as though it were nothing more than a switch. General anesthesia takes this to the other extreme. Under its influence, the machinery of the self and the world is shut down entirely. The body remains alive, neural activity continues, but the sense of being someone vanishes. Hours later, you wake with no story to bridge the gap. It is as if your existence was erased, only to be written again when consciousness returned. These experiences expose identity as fragile, capable of disappearing completely when the right circuits go quiet. Neuroscience increasingly frames the self not as a substance, but as a generative process. Predictive processing models suggest that the brain builds the I in the same way it builds its picture of the external world, by creating and updating guesses. The self is a model stitched together from memory, interoception, and social feedback, maintained as long as the predictions hold. But just like any other model, it is fallible, temporary, subject to collapse when the underlying signals shift. Philosopher Thomas Metzinger goes further. He argues that there is no one behind the experience at all. What we call self is a transparent model, the brain's useful fiction that we mistake for an actual entity. It feels real only because the model hides its own construction. To be human is to live inside a convincing illusion that cannot be easily seen through. The implication is profound. The I you feel so certain of may be less like a soul or a substance, and more like a momentary interface, software generated by the brain to navigate the world. And like software, it can be turned off. When prefrontal regions reactivate, lucidity flickers back. When anesthesia silences the network, identity vanishes entirely. The toggle effect reveals the truth. The self is not the ground of reality, but a temporary simulation running on top of it. This raises an even deeper question. If the self is a model, then what is it modeling for? What is the reality beneath the mask that switches on and off? The answer leads us beyond science into territory humanity has been mapping for thousands of years. Long before neuroscience could track brain networks, sages and mystics were already mapping the strange terrain of sleep. For them, the nightly disappearance of the self was not an incidental detail of biology, but a doorway into the deepest truths about what we are. The Mandukya Upanishad, one of the most concise yet profound texts in Advaita Vedanta, describes three ordinary states of experience: waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. But it goes further, pointing to a mysterious fourth state, turiya, that underlies them all. In waking, the self appears as the doer, engaged with the world. In dreams, it becomes a shapeshifter, inhabiting scenarios spun from the mind. In deep sleep, even that vanishes, leaving only a blankness without self. Yet according to the sages, there is something continuous through all three states, a silent awareness, not bound by identity. Buddhism arrives at a parallel insight through the teaching of the two truths. Conventionally, the self exists. It acts, chooses, suffers, but ultimately it is empty, a bundle of conditions that dissolve the moment those conditions shift. Sleep was seen as a natural demonstration of this emptiness. Every night, the carefully held fiction of I collapses without resistance, showing that what we cling to as solid is nothing more than a temporary configuration. Taoist writings echo the same intuition with a different flavor. In Zhuangzi's famous tale, he dreams of being a butterfly, only to wake and wonder whether he is a man who dreamed of a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming of being a man. The boundaries between identities blur, exposing the instability of the self across waking and dreaming. Taoist and later Zen traditions celebrated this forgetting, treating it as freedom from the burden of constant self-reference. What's striking is not just that these traditions noticed the disappearance of identity, but that they treated it as essential to understanding reality. To fall asleep is not merely to rest, it is to glimpse the impermanence of the self, and, by extension, to question its ultimacy. In different languages and metaphors, these traditions converge with modern science. Both recognize that the I we cling to is provisional, fragile, and not the ground of who we truly are. And yet, ancient wisdom, and contemporary science leave us with the same unresolved question. If the self dissolves each night, what is it that remains? What is present in the silence of deep sleep, when even identity is absent? The answer leads us into the heart of the mystery. If the self can dissolve so completely, what carries you through the night? Something wakes in the morning. Something feels continuity, even though the you who fell asleep was nowhere to be found for hours. The paradox deepens here. The self vanishes, yet experience resumes. What is it that remains when you're gone? The first step is to distinguish between the narrative self and awareness itself. The narrative self is the story, a bundle of memory, identity, and personal history. Awareness is different. It is the silent capacity for experience, the open space in which thoughts, sensations, and even the sense of self appear. When the story shuts down in deep sleep, the stage of awareness doesn't necessarily disappear with it. It waits, empty of content, until the lights of identity switch back on. Some contemplative traditions claim this can be verified. Advanced meditation practitioners describe moments of remaining aware in dreamless sleep, conscious of the absence itself. Research has begun to explore these reports, finding hints that awareness can persist even when the networks of self are off. It is difficult to measure, yet the testimonies converge. There may be a continuity deeper than the ego. Even without such training, we can glimpse this truth in subtle ways. Notice how, as you fall asleep, the self unravels in stages. First, thoughts slow. Then your sense of being the thinker loosens until the last coherent thread snaps. Hours later, the self reforms on waking, as if nothing happened. But if you look closely, you will see that the gap has already been there all along. Proves that continuity is not owned by the self, but by something more fundamental. Near-death experiences point in a similar direction. When the self's machinery collapses under extreme conditions, many describe a strange continuity of awareness, silent, vast, untouched by the absence of identity. These accounts don't prove immortality, but they echo the same possibility. Consciousness may not be as tightly bound to the story of me as we assume. The practical invitation is simple. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, notice the boundary where selfhood thins. Watch as the sense of I fades, and welcome the moment it disappears. In the morning, notice how it reappears, stitched back together out of memory and expectation. This cycle is not a flaw. It is a clue. The true continuity of your existence is not the fragile story that vanishes, but the silent presence in which it comes and goes. For many, the thought of the self vanishing is terrifying. It feels like losing everything. Yet every night you rehearse this disappearance without fear. You surrender to sleep, and the self dissolves, not with panic, but with ease. The vanishing that seems so dreadful in theory is lived as natural, effortless, and safe. Seen this way, the nightly disappearance becomes a kind of training. Life is showing you that selfhood is not as essential as you imagine. You can let go, and still something remains. What you are is not diminished when the story pauses. It is revealed to be larger than the story. The self is fragile, but the ground in which it arises is untouched. Philosophy suggests this is liberation. To recognize that you are not the thing that comes and goes is to loosen the grip of fear. If the I can vanish and return 1,000 times, then what you truly are cannot be reduced to that temporary pattern. Instead of clinging to the self as your anchor, you can begin to see its disappearance as a gateway. There is awe in this. Each night is a rehearsal of death, and each morning is a resurrection. But rather than a tragedy, it is a rhythm, a reminder that identity is not the ultimate foundation of existence. What disappears is only the mask. What remains is the silence that wears every mask and survives every vanishing. So the disappearance of the self is not an end, but an opening. What looks like loss is actually freedom. Freedom from the illusion that you are a fixed, permanent entity. Freedom to live as something wider, deeper, more mysterious than the narrow character you mistake for yourself. And in that recognition, what once felt like death begins to feel like release. Every night, the self proves its own fragility. The memories, the voice in your head, the one who says, I, all of it collapses without resistance. And yet, something wakes again. Something that has never once failed to return. If the self were who you truly are, its disappearance would be the end. But it never is. This is the paradox that can change how you live. What you are is not the fleeting story that switches off when the brain grows quiet. What you are is the silent presence that allows every story, every dream, every identity to appear and disappear. Awareness has never been proven to vanish. It is the one constant, the stillness behind all beginnings and endings. When you know this, even dimly, life feels different. You stop clinging so tightly to the passing drama of being someone. You begin to live as if each moment is a gift borrowed by the self, but owned by something larger. Fear of death loosens its grip because you recognize you have already practiced it thousands of times, and each time awareness was untouched. So tonight, when you lie down and feel yourself drifting away, pause for just a breath. Notice the dissolving of I. And in the morning, when the self reappears, ask, who or what was there in the gap? If this opens something in you, claim it. Leave a comment with the phrase, I am more than the self. Let it be a reminder to you, and a signal to everyone here that we are awakening together. This circle is not about answers, but about walking deeper into the mystery of what you truly are. Awareness itself, limitless, silent, unbroken. If you're not yet, please subscribe. There's way more to discover about you. Thanks for watching.